Is there such a thing as too much luck? Is there such a thing as too much fun? Messing around, wondering how it's taken so long. I'm really so strong. It's not too much at all.
Welcome to Too Much with Denise Love Hewitt. Today's topic is self-defense for social media. The media landscape has changed significantly, and we never got a manual or a best practices on how to properly engage with it as it evolved. So I brought Nick Susi here today to edify us. Nick Susi is a strategy executive, researcher, and writer, exploring the forces, technological, societal, and psychological, that shape our identity, perception, and culture. He has led strategy for dotdotdash, Complex, The Fader, Jay-Z's former media brand, Life+Times. His research and writing can be found in Business of Fashion, Friends with Benefits, Water and Music, Matt Klein's ZINE, Joshua Citarella's Do Not Research, Future Commerce, and Boys Club. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks for having me, Denise.
I'm very excited to dig into this with you. Nick is one of my favorite people to get hot takes from. He's very good at synthesizing many variables and distilling them into a linear narrative. So I admire that because sometimes I've got 20 tabs open in my brain and I'm not always good at bringing them together. And I think you really excel at that.
Oh, to be fair in your defense, I'm looking at you, but I also see my 30 open tabs right now. So
Well, good to know I'm not alone. So let's start at the very beginning. I want to give the audience an understanding of what do you think have been the most significant shifts in the media landscape over the past decade?
whoa, that's a big one. I mean, okay, well, let's start somewhere, and you can redirect me based on
Great.
where you want to go. But I think let's focus on social media specifically, and we can go broader from there. But I think when I look at the last, not even decade, but like the past 20-ish years, there's obviously a lot of significant shifts in media becoming more social, right? So I think like late 90s into the 2000s, you have like early forums and blogs and whatnot start to become a thing. So not necessarily like social media as we know it today, but it was definitely the democratization of anyone who has a voice and interest or whatever now has like these platforms where they can share their thoughts and opinions or creativity or whatever it is without the traditional media gatekeepers. That was quite significant for like the opening of the gates, right? And these niche communities having places to congregate online. Then it expands to social graphs being introduced, where now yourself in the context of other selves and identities can be connected in different ways. And you have these like digital town squares starting to form through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the early days of those things from like late 2000s to the 2010s, right? Social media evolves. It's like when I was posting just dumb pictures on Instagram with shitty filters as I'm like helping my dad move houses is like a very pure moment for social media in those times. Much more authentic in like a true sense than maybe how we talk about it now, of just how like friends, family, people you admire, you follow. The algorithms start to become looking like more similar to what they are today, right? This is like maybe late 2010s. So they were made for a reason, right? It's like, how can these algorithms help hyper personalized discovery of the things that we're interested in and connect us better to those interest points? So starting to show us things that maybe we wanted to see but didn't know, right? And there is like a bit of magic to that I think did exist that we felt in a way that maybe we feel differently about now because it really knows us. And then I think as that continued to evolve, and especially as like TikTok really took off, the creator economy really started to grow around this idea of social media as we know it today, where everyone who could possibly be famous about something is trying to be famous about that thing. There's more avenues perhaps to try to blow up overnight through these different channels, and maybe true, maybe an aspiration, but creators of different niches like trying to earn a living through these platforms and channels, right? And so all of those things have led us to today and our relationship with social media, which I think maybe most people would say feels a little bad. Reality feels malleable and fragmented. We have these filter bubbles. It feels perhaps like those who shout the loudest command the most attention, and with that attention have power and domination over our present state. Everyone is running like crazy, chasing virality, trying to turn a human into a brand, putting on these performances in front of their iPhones for broadcast, or perhaps compressing our identities into these things and looking at others from a place of comparison of how we can do it like them. It feels like the internet runs on rage, and everything is war and conflict and extremism and polarization. And perhaps now with AI becoming a thing, all of this will get worse, right? These are all the negative narratives swirling around us now as it relates to social media today. So that maybe gives us a good foundation to jump from.
100%.
I guess the last thing I'll say is the most succinct way of articulating this, I think, is what we refer to as social media across this whole arc is, I think the earlier days, social media felt a lot more social. And I think social media now feels a lot more media, is how I'd maybe say it.
You touch on something when you said in the early days of Instagram, it just felt very authentic and very magical. And part of why people really loved TikTok in the beginning was because it felt like the algorithm knew you. It felt very personalized and special. And now, if you're really paying attention, I can tell when I'm being thrown propaganda versus what feels authentic to me. You start to see the shift in like what starts in a pure place sort of evolves, and you can start to suss out what feels less and less authentic, I guess, about what you're being fed. I think that's a really good point to put an asterisk on, because there's a reason we all loved these platforms in the beginning. And so it's important to remember the good parts of how they brought people together and made information and aspiration very accessible. Before we get a little deeper, I want to touch base on a basic understanding of how content proliferates in the current model.
Just in like a general sense, like where do things go?
Just sort of how the engine works, or so people can understand, because I know there's a few factors that can create proliferation, and I just want to make sure people understand what those factors are. So as you and I go deeper, people are with us.
Sure. Yeah. I think this has changed over time, but right now it feels like for something that really takes off in like a viral or mainstream trajectory way, it feels like it starts from these small little pockets and then grows to the mainstream. And I don't know that it's always like a linear path that follows the same steps, but I think a lot of those things emerge from the fringes or smaller kind of niche places, whether now it's like, some individual person's Substack or like a meme on TikTok or Twitter or something starts to take off. And then you start to see like the commentators and critics at a smaller level start to cover these things again, like, Substack or these personalities across social starts get picked up by like the more mainstream press or more like niche press than to more mainstream press. And then you have it across all different types of media channels beyond social media, if it's like TV, news, whatever. So it does feel like there's different tiers and rungs of how these things start to evolve. But I think one extra layer I'll add to that now, because so much content feels derivative of other content at this point. My friend Ruby calls it para content, but similar to like parasocial relationships, like they're not totally real or direct. But if you think about like Marvel puts out a movie and then that movie gets infinitely more views than the movie itself through YouTube of like all the Marvel fans talking about it, or Kendrick puts out an album that's X amount of streams, but then you go on all different social media channels and you have billions more views of people just like talking about or commentating on the thing itself. So it does feel like we're in this era of like commentary and meta commentary of the things itself and how we engage with media, whether it's from the source or not.
That's interesting. I want to just talk about two things, which is the attention economy, that what we pay attention to is what proliferates, and then the pay to play side of the proliferation of content.
People have been talking about the attention economy for a while. I feel like my twist on that is I feel like it's much closer to like the rage economy at this point. It's not just any attention. Like it feels like at this point, the things really commanding attention is the most sensational versions of a thing. Rage bait is very much a thing, using these manipulative tactics to elicit outrage or some kind of sensationalized reaction to things with the ultimate goal of just like driving engagement, or maybe leveraging that engagement to then make money or even push someone down some kind of like ideological path. But it really does feel like the internet runs on rage. And I had looked a while ago, like last year, I'm sure it's probably the same, but if you look at Google Trends and like the term rage bait over time, I think it was coined in like 2009 or something. It's just gone up and up. And I think it was around the 2020 or something. It's just like a hockey stick up. So it feels like the internet's getting angrier. And I think that is true. And it really does feel like the things that command our attention or really our rage is like what ends up becoming our reality. Because like from my perspective, our attention is scarce and finite. We can't just like be infinitely aware of all things all the time. So whatever we're focused on is like in our field of view, and what's in our field of view affects us and what we think and believe and ultimately like act and how we show up in the real world. So our attention really does shape our reality, which I think explains a lot of like why everyone's attention's in such different places and having such different experiences of what is like real.
So knowing that, how do I, as a person who has to engage with the internet as a part of life, as a part of work, if I know that most of what proliferates is rage bait, how do I set myself up to value the right things instead of the wrong things? Like it feels like it's unavoidable. Like we're creating a more and more polarizing binary culture. And so much of that I think does have to do with rage bait. Like obviously we know we shouldn't engage with sensationalized headlines, right? Like obviously we know a lot of the things, but in practice, what's a good advice to help us be better on the internet?
Yeah, I mean, we can spend a lot of time talking about this. This is just my personal opinion, but like I am a big believer in really arming people with their own education and tools and allowing people to figure out for themselves how they want to navigate and orient themselves. I say that mostly in reaction to something you just said about what is right or wrong. Yes, there are some things that perhaps can be like objectively right or wrong, but I think really I'm of the mindset it's less about telling people like what to think or what to do and more about how you can arm people much earlier kind of in the stream or kind of up top before it even gets to that point, because it just feels like a game of whack-a-mole to try to be starting at the bottom of the pile, trying to whack down everything that may not be right or wrong or true or false, whatever. That just seems like a very difficult, endless task versus just like, how do we help people be just like more knowledge and grown people, right? And I think part of that is there's a lot of chat about media literacy. It's like, if only everyone was more media literate, all of our problems would be solved, right? I hear that narrative a lot, and I don't think that's totally untrue, but I think that's like a little myopic, where there are other aspects of media beyond just media literacy that I think goes broader into like media theory or media studies that explains a lot more than just what is true or false. So I'll explain that a little more, but because I think media literacy is an important skill set of like how one consumes media, what is in their diet, how are they analyzing the things that are coming across their feed or attention, why does one create the content that they do, all of those things. And I think media literacy to me feels very like practical and educational, and how one critically navigates content, right? So you can look at something and be like, that's misinformation, or this person is biased in this way, or this media company is owned by this person, which would then affect like these types of things that come out of it, whether it's an article or memes or ads or whatever, all of those things. And those are obviously really important skill sets. Nothing is wrong with that. But I think it misses some bigger things where, for example, are you familiar with Marshall McLuhan?
Yes, but for the audience, we just give a
Yeah.
little top line.
Yeah. So Marshall McLuhan, I think it, I would very much recommend reading a lot of his work, especially The Medium is the Message, because I think he's quite ahead of his times and quite prolific in explaining things, decades ago that are very much the dominant norm today. But if you look at a lot of his perspective on media theory, it's much more philosophical and how one understands what the effects of media and technology are on like our being and our consciousness and how
Mm.
that affects society and our perception and how that ultimately impacts not just us as individuals but like what our culture is, right? um, and it's not just about how we critically consume content, but it's more about these broader invisible structures of media as an environment or media as like an ecology that we exist
Mm.
within, and how different mediums like social media or TV or printed material, whatever, like they all have different type of sensory experiences that affect us and how that shapes our perception and how we like live our lives. um, and I think it's that kind of effect on our senses that's also really important to understand beyond just is this right or wrong, that's often missed when I see these debates or calls for media literacy. So I guess a very succinct way I make an analogy around that is media literacy is like teaching somebody how to swim in the ocean, whereas these broader like media theory concepts like from McLuhan or someone else is more about like what is the ocean, and if
Yeah.
humans were to be pushed underwater, do they drown, do they survive, do we evolve to exist underwater? Like it's much more broad and philosophical, and I think some of those calls for media literacy don't get deep enough into like why are we here, like why is it that we keep shouting these different things trying to correct things from down here than like these broader changes that are happening with media that affect us individually and collectively.
That's a very interesting perspective, but I want to get a little brass tacks, which is say I'm trying to understand how to navigate what the ocean is for me. And I understand you want to arm people with their ability to have self trust and make the right decisions for themselves, which I agree is very important. But what are some basic things people can do? Say you have more of an addiction towards these platforms, it dysregulates you. It's constant stimulation. It's very hard to sometimes get out of that sort of cycle once you're in it. I'm going to compare this to a paradigm that my friend created called the surviving self and the thriving self. And so the way she frames it is when we're in the surviving self, we can't even think about thriving. The story we tell ourselves, and this is Tina Lifford, by the way, for anyone
Mm.
wondering, she has an amazing, amazing company called the Inner Fitness Movement. And so she says basically, if I'm in the surviving self, I think that when all my needs are met, I can start to thrive. When you are in the thriving self, your understanding of the world is my needs are met because I'm thriving, which is very true. I've actually lived this principle. I went from living in deep scarcity and worried about stuff to coming to the thriving self and finding that my basic needs were consistently met. And so I've been thinking of this in the same way, which is like the ocean having the ability to look out and analyze the ocean is the thriving self. And I feel like when you're underwater, you're like, I don't even know what water I'm in. I can't even think about it. I'm just trying to breathe. Does that
Mm.
resonate with you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple things, some of the more practical things that you're asking about when it comes to more the media literacy side is the the basics, like the foundational knowledge and skills of like, are you fact checking things? Do you know how to fact check things? Do you understand how to identify the bias in a source? Like we are all biased, subjective human beings, right? Can we see that whether it's from an individual or like I was saying before, maybe from like a media outlet overall, a New York Times versus a Fox? That's obviously like a very obvious
Yeah.
extreme example. All important things, or even just like how algorithms work, or that like clickbait or rage bait even exists, right? Like I think all of these basic principles of knowledge. But I will say, on the other hand, um, there's something Ryan Broderick, who runs Garbage Day, which is an excellent newsletter and media company. One headline he wrote last year has really stuck with me. And I think it was around the Kate Middleton craziness that had happened when she was like, everyone was like, where is she? Like, what happened?
Yeah. Yeah, the conspiracy theories, you're like, I think
Yeah.
she's just sick.
Yeah. But the headline of this article was misinformation is fun. And I think, the initial reaction is that like, oh, that's dark. Like, how do we fix that? But it really does feel like the place we're in where even if a conspiracy theory or a meme or something is wrong, I feel like we exist in this state where it doesn't matter in the sense that people are just trying to use these, like, I would refer to as like fan fictions almost,
Yeah.
of like alternate or revisionist realities that is just like, oh, we're just like having fun, even though they can have quite negative effects. But I think that feels like part of the driving force of Kate Middleton is just like this character, right? She's not real.
Right.
She's just like something I see on the internet. I'm just going to make up fan fiction about what crazy shit's happening in her life, right? But these are like real people. But media like really disembodies and disconnects us from like really feeling and having to sit in that, I think.
Well, imagination is not dead. That's the part that is very clear to me as I read some of these things. The problem becomes when we can't discern between what is imagination and what is reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm all about magical thinking and exploratory thinking. I love that. I love going down what ifs and pipelines. But I think there's something that's happening online where the two get blurred.
Yeah. So a lot of my work, it feels like for the past few years, has keeps revolving around magic and magical thinking. And one thing in particular that I feel like keeps coming up is I feel like there's this pattern that I'm seeing over the history of technology and really like electric media, basically since the birth of the telegraph, where every time there's this new wave of like technological innovation, there's this new wave of like magical thinking. These things kind of move in tandem with each other. There's this Arthur C. Clarke quote, which maybe you've heard: Any sufficient advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." It's like kind of pointing at a similar thing, where when we're in the earlier phases of these new technologies or new media, it still has that newness and magic that's easy to fall into magical thinking. We've definitely been experiencing that with social media, and I think we're about to really be hit hard in a whole new way with AI, right? In the same kind of way. Um, but I think part of my point is this has happened with the telegraph, the telephone, the TV, like all of these things. It just keeps happening.
Can you give
We,
me an
yeah,
example of what happened when the telegraph happened and TV happened that
yeah,
was that version of magical thinking?
totally, totally. So with the telegraph, so this would have been like the 1840s or something, but there was these two young sisters. They're like teenagers, the Fox sisters, and so the telegraph came out and it was like a new mode of communication, right? It's like tapping to send these telegrams, like Morse code, out through the wires, right? And these sisters started basically hosting these like seances where they invite people and say like, you can communicate with ghosts or spirits, and they would use this Morse code type tapping on tables or walls or whatever to communicate with the dead. And it really sparked this new wave of like a Western spiritualism movement that
Oh,
really
cool.
started with pulling from this mode of communication from this new medium of the time that suggested that we now know how to communicate with spirits. And that went, I mean, it was 1840s, went viral by 1840s standards. But there's this pattern happens over and over again as new technology and mediums are born.
I'm surprised they weren't punished as like women talking to the dead. Women and witches, it's a long history. But in fifth grade, I pretended to be a witch. I had a thing going with my friend in fifth grade, and her mom called my mom, and I got in trouble. And I remember being like, I can't believe I just got punished for having an imagination.
Mm. I totally misquote this because I got dinner with my friend Mac last night and he just told me this and I wasn't familiar, so I'm gonna butcher this. But He was telling me that when the printing press also was like born, the first book that like really was adopted by the mainstream wasn't the Bible, but it was, I'm gonna forget the name, but it was basically a story about like witches and like possession and like the Antichrist. And it was the widespread nature of this book through this new technology and medium that it really pushed a lot of these like witch trials and stuff to hit like a whole new level. But
Wow. Okay. So then what happened with TV? What was the magical path there?
yeah, there is what was it called?
Don't tell me it's witches again.
Oh, I'm gonna Google this real quick before I totally misquote myself.
Every time it's like witches.
No, this one wasn't witches. It wasn't called Chromavision. This is gonna kill me. I'm gonna think of it after. Basically, the Vatican uh, rounded up a bunch of scientists and I guess priests or whatever, and claimed that they had created this new technology that allowed you to like see into the past. And
Not witches. This is all very like spooky wooky, like woo woo. I thought it was gonna be something so different, but now as we're talking about this, I'm like, conspiracy theory is like, okay, seances. I'm like, it's all the same pattern.
yeah, this is my point. Anyways, they claim that they had created this thing. It wasn't. It was called like Chroma Vision or something. And if you look at like some of these blueprints, like it looks like what the television looked like in the '60s or whatever, right? They claim that they could see images of Jesus Christ, and it's like, yeah, you can like put that on a TV screen, right? So yes, to your point, that's kind of what I'm getting at. Is yes, there's like very real effects of technology and media, but also I think there's like a humanness to this almost in a sense of just for whatever reason, the way that we or many of us are wired, we just kind of have this response to new unfamiliar things that we kind of default to magical thinking. And so this is where I guess part of my point is about where media literacy doesn't quite get to that point, but I think it's important to understand how what our relationship is with media and how it affects us and how we have these kind of default responses or potential ones so that we may not have control over what media or technology is being created as individuals, but if we understand what our default responses might be, we can start to have more empathy and awareness and understanding for ourselves if we like slip into this, or if we see someone else that maybe we disagree with, maybe there's some empathy to be like, well, I can at least understand how someone might get there.
Totally. Totally. Is there a good place to like say I'm new to the concept of media literacy? Is there a good website or someone that's maybe modeling best practices or a place where people can do more diligence?
A specific source comes to mind necessarily. I mean, there's a lot of good books that one could Google. There's nothing comes to mind specifically, but there's like, media literacy and misinformation, disinformation researchers and stuff that are on social media. But I think, yeah, first, encourage researching and reading more of that, just the general basics. But again, like, I'll share a story. This was it last year or the year before? One of the misinformation, disinformation researchers I follow on Twitter, who's great. This was after October 7th, everything that had kicked off then in Israel, and had seen them posting some things that, as I was researching further, were ultimately wrong. And I think what's to me interesting is even for those of us who are incredibly like educated and specialized on these like methods, right, are still susceptible to certain things, right? And I think I don't want to cherry pick that specific example necessarily, but I think identity plays such a big role in all of this, where our inability to see how we self-identify forms some of these biases or the kind of lens through which we see the world.
Yeah.
Even when we can have all the tools and be like a elite degreed person in these things still can fall for them when we don't see ourselves and how, like, at an identity level that this gets a little murky.
And I would couple that with nervous system
Yeah.
regulation.
Yeah.
I think they go hand in hand. Listen, like even the most intelligent, most edified person in this category will get duped by an AI image or something like that along the way. And so that's the part where I think this is all a human experience we're having. And I like what you say about being compassionate to people's experiences and not shaming them or getting mad at them that they have facts wrong. My tactic, at least with like my sort of inner circle of my family, is you can't put anything in the family chat if it's not fact checked. I'm like, I don't want to do the like the dance. Everyone has to just do a basic level of make sure that's grounded in something real and then happy to read it, engage with it. But it's very easy to get caught up, especially when we're talking about rage bait, hitting triggers in your brain that cause your cortisol to rise, you to activate, and then you're just like pissed and you're just like, I'm sending this. And you're like, well, do we bother to actually make sure that we're getting worked up about something real? Or is it not real? And that's what I think is the hard part to do, because the way that rage bait works is it preys upon activating these identity points. It preys upon activating your cortisol and getting to a place where you are less rational in how you engage. And that's
Yeah,
by design.
totally. There's a lot of work and research I was doing last year around the relationship between war and media, both war in a literal sense, but also war in like a metaphorical sense of like we're talking about everything feels very polarized and conflict driven, even if not literally war. But I think a lot of where I was landing was some of the core tenets that drive our response to these things is what you're saying. It's like rage or a sensory kind of response. Identity, as I was mentioning before, it's just like based on how we construct ourself and how that plays into getting pulled into this versus that, right? And then also just how the framing of like myth and mythology and narrative of just like you have the side that is good and the side that is evil, and it's like very
Right.
binary and nothing in between. And I think it's those three things combined is what really fuels a lot of this, and then media plays the role of like further acceleration and amplification of those things. But it feels like those are a lot of the ingredients that when those stars aligned, a lot of this starts to really spin.
Do you think there should be limits on what people can spend to push certain types of content? Is that something you've like, I don't know what the answer is here, but I do think there's a level of potential regulation that needs to happen around what can be pushed, because obviously you create a very unfair playing ground when you have a pay to play system versus a meritocracy. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I know that this can become a very political and philosophical debate, but I think I generally fall on whatever side of the spectrum of uh, not censorship. I think part of the reason I say that is we've seen over the past decade plus a lot of deplatforming and cancellation and censorship and etc. And that doesn't seem to have really slowed
Mm.
anything down. If anything, I would argue it's maybe made it worse. And this goes back to my first point about I think of the mindset that there's an approach where you tell people what is right and wrong, and there's an approach where you arm people with knowledge and education and tools to be able to like navigate and orient for themselves. Again, this is another, it can be a very political and philosophical debate, but if we think about the TikTok ban, right, there's a lot of valid viewpoints on whether or not that should happen. But I think one thing I would say is like, I find it, how do I say this? Like, if it's true that we're worried as the US that to have a, you know, a Chinese company be able to have this like really predominant media channel exist here, that a significant amount of people are susceptible to that. If that's true, why is it that the removal of that's the solution rather than, well, why are people so susceptible, right? Like, shouldn't it
Yeah,
part
that's a
of the
great point.
solution be how we arm people with just better knowledge and tools and education. Because really, I think it's not about that. It's about probably the US wants to have that kind of control over people.
Well, you tap into like it's sort of a layered answer because one of the issues we have, right, is that you don't have an equal playing field for education in this country. And so then you're asking people, well, how do we then disseminate that ability for them to arm themselves with the information and the knowledge when you have such discrepancies in education? In this current administration, you're seeing funding for public education being pulled. I think it's a big question. How do we give, and I know the internet is a free tool that anyone can use in Google, but I also think it can be overwhelming. And so, how do we invest in people appropriately and show them where to go so that they can feel that self agency? But I think it's two things competing at once to get to the heart of it, which is like if it's a country's responsibility to give you the tools, then how do we do that effectively?
Yeah, totally. Another thing I was thinking about as we're talking about this, I saw this documentary a couple years ago with my friend Matt Klein, who has this great um, thing, ZINE, that he's the writer and author for, and also he's the head of foresight at Reddit. And we saw this documentary about anti-vaxxers a few years ago together. And the movie's very well done. It was like executive produced by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who was there and gave like a very entertaining Q&A afterwards. We were talking about it afterwards, and I really had this gripe with it where it's just like, I feel like this documentary and many documentaries deeply misunderstand who is it for, and then how do you talk to and persuade that
Right.
audience.
Right.
And Matt and I only know this because there's a Q&A, because like everyone would stand up and introduce themselves. Everyone in that theater except for Matt and I was like a medical professional. It was like doctors and nurses and like
Right.
people that already understand the issue.
Right.
And I find this particular example, it's like the whole thing was oriented around people who were like externally being labeled as anti-vaxxers. And I think, I don't mean to pick on this specific topic or film because I think it's more emblematic of a broader thing that I see where there's too much of this obsession with like how we label others versus thinking about how those people would label and identify themselves, which in this case, I would say so many of these people would probably classify themselves as parents and first time parents in most of those cases. And how, as a parent at that identity level, you're feeling, to your point, like at a sensory level, very real fear and anxiety about a choice you might make that could fuck up your child forever, right? Whether or not that's real or fake or right or wrong, like that is the identity and the feeling of that context. And I just think that there's like perhaps a different way that we could be approaching communicating with other people if we're able to see how they see themselves and think about what is like the language or approach or whatever of how you start to have those conversations. Because I think there's so much, we kind of default to war mode, right? It's like this versus that, and we need to defeat or change or fix or whatever, right? And I feel like that is often not effective if you're trying to like, I'm going to change this person's behavior or beliefs, versus doing much harder work, which is like, how do you broaden one's beliefs without dismantling their sense of self?
Yeah.
And that's hard.
Well, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because the whole point of talking to people that have different stances than you is that when you're engaging with curiosity, you're not engaging to make them come to your side. You're engaging with compassion, and the reality is they may not come to your side. And so, how do you hold that tension? And I have a few relationships in my life where that tension exists. We disagree on things. I have learned over time that my love for them outweighs that one tension point. And I've also understand their perspective. It may not be my perspective, but that's part of what makes humanity great, is accepting the different parts of us. If we were all the same, it'd be pretty boring. And I think one of the things you talk about is that we're all speaking in these echo chambers. So this doc is, in a room of doctors, you're speaking to people that are on the side of the message. The true success of a documentary like that is putting it in a room, as you say, with people that disagree, seeing what their reaction is. When I speak at conferences, is one of the things I tell my agencies is that I don't just want to speak in the room where people agree with me. I want to speak in a room that might, like, for example, my talk on inequity in venture capital, a room of venture capitalists that might have a lot of issue with my message. But it comes from a loving place of me wanting to create more equity in that space. And if that's something they're open to, great. Like if they're not, they're not. And they might leave the talk. My friend just did a talk in Pakistan. She's Afghani. And all these people left her talk. And she was like at first really upset about it because she was like, it made me feel so uncomfortable. But she's like, obviously, I was activating something in them that they chose to leave. So it doesn't matter whether they chose to leave. I've planted a seed regardless if they come around or not. That's where the good stuff lives because that's where the opportunity exists. It doesn't do anything if we're just talking to someone that already agrees with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I agree that there's good framing. My friend Reggie James has a good newsletter that's very like product and technology, often hardware focused, called Product Loss, but he often talks about politics as well. And one thing he had written recently was about the difference between bonding and bridging. It's making the same point as what you're saying. And we talk about things like preaching to the choir, right? Like that's the bonding. There's a role and a time and a place for that. But I think I see a lot of folks tend to default to shouting at crowds of friends and peers who already agree, especially through social media, versus what is like real bridging look like to sit down and commune with someone who sees things differently. But
yeah, and it's more uncomfortable. And that's the muscle that the internet doesn't really help you flex because you can just turn it off and not engage or say something behind a screen. And that's the part that I just feel some resistance around is this we're losing the ability to hold that tension, which I think is a very important part of being human.
There's this I haven't listened to this in a while. I don't know if it's still running, but there's this podcast that I enjoyed called Conversations with People Who Hate Me. Have you heard about this?
No, I'm going to listen to it. That sounds awesome.
This guy, I think he was a writer at Vox or something. I'm misrepresenting this, so apologies. But he would get like hateful comments frequently through his writing and internet personality. And he would reach out to people and DM them and be like, hey, would you love to come on my podcast and talk about this disagreement? And the conversations are fascinating, right? Like it's really rare to be able to have that kind of like voyeuristic fly on the wall of like people coming, like starting from a point of connection of like disagreement and borderline hatred, depending on the context, and just seeing where the conversation goes. Like that's so beautiful, I think.
I think you usually always find middle ground.
Yeah, totally.
So before we end here, I want to know, what are we getting wrong about the internet?
Well, I think I've given my hot takes about arming people with education versus maybe telling them explicitly what is right or wrong all the time. Some differences between media literacy and broader kind of theoretical media things I think are important. I think you and I were talking about this the other day. Resiliency skills I think are really important. My friend who does a lot of work around youth mental health, I'll give an example. I'll bring it back to media, but he does a lot of work with folks around youth mental health. He used to live out here in LA. He would often do these group sessions with like celebrities and influencers, and many of them had severe like drug or alcohol addiction, so like mind altering substances. And what would often happen is the people around them, their friends, their peers, their teams, whatever, what they would do with great intention is like you remove the objects and triggers from the environment. You remove alcohol, drugs from the home. They're not allowed to go to certain bars or places or parties or whatever. And in removing those objects and triggers, you now are in a place where you are safe and you don't have access to those things. But what would happen is we live in a society and these things exist. They don't just go away. And as soon as there's kind of like an interaction or like a touch point, there's this immediate snapback and relapse, and they kind of fall backwards. And a lot of that's because they're not instilling like true long-term resiliency skills. They're like these short-term copes. And I see very similar things with technology and media where the conversations are very similar. It's like we need to remove these things, right? Which could be true and not wrong, or like part of the solution, but also what do true longer term resiliency skills look like around technology and media, like media as a mind altering substance also, where we are able and capable of existing within this environment that contains all of these triggers and not be triggered. I think that's a big one that I don't know that we're fully there yet collectively. But
I don't think we are, but it's a good thing to leave people with, to meditate on. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us. I learned a lot and it was very helpful. A lot of good references. I'll do my best to put them in the show notes. I may not get them all, but I'll try.
I'll send you some.
Please do. I'll put them all in. And Nick, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. Like, so grateful.
Thanks for having me, Denise.
Thank you so much for listening. If you do like listening, it would mean the world to us if you could subscribe or review the podcast anywhere that you watch or listen to the podcast. It really helps with the algorithm to share this with the world. I want to give a special thank you to young Spielberg and Sarah Yarkin for their beautiful work on our opening jingle, Dana Boulos for her help with the beautiful art, and to all of you for tuning in and keeping this dream alive. If you want to hear certain topics or from certain guests, please feel free to email us. We really, really want to hear from you and see how we can best support you. See you next time.